Hi, my name is Emily Ramirez. I'm an adult services librarian at West Hollywood Library. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing you to tonight's speakers. Leading our conversation is our county librarian, Sky Patrick. Sky was appointed to her role in 2016. She's responsible for the library's 86 libraries, 15 vehicle mobile fleet, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. From the beginning of her tenure, Patrick prioritized community engagement through visioning sessions, inviting the public to share their ideas for local libraries. Her mission has been to break down barriers and expand access by developing programs that meet the needs of LA County's diverse communities. Under Sky's leadership, LA County received the 2023 National Medal for Museum and Library Service, the nation's highest honor given to museums and libraries. She is also a recipient of the 2025 James Irvine Leadership Award, which recognizes leaders whose innovative solutions to critical state challenges improve people's lives, create opportunity, and contribute to a better California. Patrick remains dedicated to reinforcing the library's role as a hub for information, literacy, civic engagement, learning, and belonging. Tonight, Sky will be interviewing Tony Valenzuela. Tony Valenzuela is the executive director of One Institute. Prior to joining One Institute, Tony was the executive director of the Foundation for the AIDS Monument, a nonprofit dedicated to installing a world-class monument in West Hollywood Park to memorialize loved ones and educate about the historic achievement of HIV/AIDS activist communities. Before working with the Foundation for the AIDS Monument, he served as the executive director of Lambda Literary, the nation's premier queer literary arts nonprofit. A leading activist and thought leader in HIV/AIDS communities since the 1990s, Tony was listed among the Out 100, the nation's most influential LGBTQ leaders for this work. Born in Los Angeles but raised in Guadalajara, Mexico, and Southern California, Tony and his husband lived in the West Adams neighborhood of Los Angeles, where they care for a small menagerie of rescue dogs and cats. Sky, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily, for that introduction, and welcome, Tony. It's good to see you. As is customary, we start these programs with LA County's land acknowledgement. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash people. We honor and pay respects to their elders, descendants, past and present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We recognize that settler colonization resulted in land seizures, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, reconciliation, and elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and their local tribal governments, including, and in no particular order, the Fernandino Tocavian Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Quiche Nation, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Again, Tony, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get into this conversation. There's so many questions I want to ask you, and we also want to make sure we save time at the end for questions from our audience. So let's start with the obvious question. Tell us a little bit about the One Institute and the work that you do, both as the executive director, but also the work that the Institute aims to tackle as an organization.
Sure. The One Institute, a lot of people don't know, is the oldest active LGBTQ organization in the country. It was founded in Los Angeles in 1952, and it has this rich legacy of accomplishments prior to Stonewall. For example, it was founded in LA in 1952, a block away from Grand Central Market downtown. It published the first widely distributed publication in the country called The One Magazine. That magazine is famous for many reasons, and we'll go into that in a bit. But for one thing, it was seized by the Postmaster General for obscenity, even though it was not an obscene magazine, and went through the courts till 1958 when the Supreme Court heard the case in 1 v. Olson, and One Incorporated won that case on free speech rights. So it's the first time an LGBT case was ever heard at the Supreme Court. And then over many decades, we've been stewards of the One Archives, which is now at USC. And the One Archives is the largest collection of LGBTQ materials in the world. So with that rich legacy, today, One Institute is an LGBTQ plus history education organization. And the way that we do that is through arts and humanities public programming. We educate about the contributions of queer and trans people throughout history. So throughout the year, One Institute might put on exhibitions or readings or screenings or workshops that engage with the public about queer and trans history. And we do that, we take an intersectional approach to doing that work. And so the subjects and the stories that we tell go far beyond the dominant narratives of queer history. We also have a whole grouping of K through 12 and educator programs. So we work
with. I was going to ask you that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we work with, I'll speak about it briefly right now, and we can go into it, but we work with K through 12 students, primarily high school students and educators, to incorporate the teaching of queer and trans history in public schools. You probably know that California has a law called the FAIR Act, the Fair Education Act, where educators are compelled to teach about the contributions of queer and trans people. And one of the things that we do in our youth programs is we create curriculum specifically for social studies and history, which we then share with various school districts, certainly LAUSD and other school districts, incorporate into their teaching. We have a youth mentorship program called the Youth Ambassadors for Queer History. Those high school students spend a semester with us learning about queer history, learning how to do archival research, and then presenting their archival research in an exhibition that they put on at the end of the program. We also do policy work. We advocate for the rights of LGBT students and educators in the district to improve the way that students are supported, to, like, as I said, participate in creating the curriculum that they learn, and also to make sure that the district is addressing emerging needs that come up for these students.
It's interesting because when you brought up the California lawsuit, I was thinking of the California versus Miller, which is part of my research, but that was really about whether or not people had the right to receive obscene, and I use quotes around that, information in the mail. So it's a little bit different. So can you tell me that law, the case one more time? I didn't get my pen out fast enough.
Sure. In 1954, the actual Supreme Court case is called One Inc., so One Incorporated versus Olson. Olson was the name of the Postmaster General in Los Angeles. Even though the One magazine, let me go a little bit into the One magazine. The Mattachine Society was one of the early LGBT rights organizations founded here in LA in 1950. And there were a group of folks from the Mattachine Society that weren't happy about the way that, what the Mattachine Society was focusing on. And they wanted to start a new organization called One Incorporated. Their first project was founding this magazine called One Magazine, which launched in 1953. And it was the first widely distributed queer publication in the country. There were 5,000 paid subscribers around the country. And that magazine published poetry and stories about books and theater. And
so not quite the pulp.
Not at all, right?
Exactly. Okay, yeah.
And
so legitimized, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like
exactly.
A legitimate magazine.
Correct. It was a legitimate magazine. And it's probably most important sort of historical. The reason it's important historically is that they accepted letters to the editor that really told the story of what queer and trans people were going through in the 1950s. So folks would write in and talk about it from all over the country, and would write in and talk about what life was like for them and wherever they lived. They might comment about something in the magazine. It was like a national conversation among queer people in that decade about their lives. And it was the first time that a magazine was legitimizing LGBT existence.
That's exactly what I was trying to get at. You said that more eloquently than me, but just kind of comparing sort of the fictional pulp kind of literature and then having this magazine for the first time that has this like dialogue, this discourse about queer life and politics. I'm curious if you know, just out of curiosity, was it mixed race, like different kinds of races involved in the magazine, or was it still primarily predominantly Caucasian?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. In fact, some of the folks that left Mattachine Society who came on to do work with One Incorporated, One Inc., were folks like Tony Reyes, who was a young Puerto Rican, Bailey Whitaker, who was a young African American, John Ojima, a Japanese American. These folks began to work on the magazine together. And in fact, the way that One Magazine was named was from a poem by a poet named Carlyle. It was, of course, predominantly gay white men, but it was also surprisingly many more folks from various communities who were part of One. And in fact, lesbians were also a part of the magazine because
I was ask that.
A feature called The Feminine Viewpoint, which was written by a lesbian. It became a regular part of the magazine called The Feminist Viewpoint. For the 1950s, at a time when there was segregation and where, there was obviously a very different time in terms of the way different races and ethnicities work together on these issues and other issues, they were ahead of many other kinds of organizations. And folks of color and lesbians and some transgender folks were a part of One's history. That became part of its legacy.
I was thinking, and I don't know the exact sort of decade around this, but I'm wondering, there was a magazine that was very popular, almost like a chat book called Lesbian Connection, that I know just through my general research that I believe started in the 70s during the women's movement, sort of the third wave of feminism. And I'm wondering now if there's a connection to One. So I'm going to go look that up, but that's a question for later. You bring up something that I find of interest when you say you work with youth. There's so much political banter, if you will, right now around the protection, what is perceived as the protection of youth in terms of censorship and LGBTQ, BIPOC stories and narratives. But you have an embedded program at schools right now that you are teaching. You have the ability to teach this next generation how to essentially respect themselves and respect one another. Can you tell us a little bit about, give me one project that you thought was just exceptional from some of these young people? What project stands out?
Sure. One of the amazing things about working with the young people that we work with is that they are, meaning, trans and non-binary and queer kids in schools, K through 12 school around the country, including in LA County, are in the crosshairs of so much backlash. Our own president in March called parents who were attempting to have gender supportive care for their kids, they called those parents child abusers. It is this kind of environment that these kids are needing to navigate. And one of the amazing things about working with our young people is that they know who they are. They are hungry for their history, for their ability to relate to the past, to understand that folks like them were also have a rich and long history.
That's right.
And they take what's going on, honestly, in stride and with a sense of humor. That's what we see in the students who go through, for example, our Youth Ambassadors for Queer History program, the semester-long program that we do in the fall. And in terms of like some projects that really stood out in that program, the kids spend a semester, like I said, part of what they learn is to do archival research, and they do it at the One Archives at USC. And they all have a project that they work on. There was a project last year on top surgery. One of the high school students did a whole project on top surgery. There was another project where a young man did a whole study on the way that the search for funding by activists sort of biases the kind of issues that we work on. They're all very sophisticated and interesting projects that they do. So I think that the projects that happen in this exhibition that they put on, which we displayed throughout February this year, are just so intelligent and honestly just full of hope. Like these kids, and I believe this, I think we have to do this work. These kids really understand that they can make an impact that makes a difference. And they're doing this before they're 18, which is astonishing to me.
Yeah,
this other project
absolutely.
that we do is called You Speak Radio. We pair a high school student with a community elder, and the youth in the program learn how to do a podcast, and they produce their own podcast, which is this intergenerational conversation between them and a community elder. So we've had people like the young people interview Phil Wilson with Black AIDS Institute or Bambi Salcedo, these folks who have made a huge impact, and create these gorgeous podcasts that we publish in the summer. So
I was just going to ask you, are they housed under the One Institute?
Yes, they are. If you go
okay.
to our One Institute website and look for You Speak Radio, you'll see, I think, 3 seasons of it, of these
Okay.
high school student created podcasts with these interviews with community change makers.
You know, you started to talk about this a little bit, and you and I are of a certain age where things slip in and out of our head and it comes back later on. You know, when we think about LGBTQ history, obviously we refer or defer to Stonewall. Naturally, it's huge and pivotal and seminal in this struggle. Obviously, the AIDS memorial quilt on the National Mall. And then naturally, when we think about California, queer politics and movement, we think of San Francisco. But what I think you're sharing with us today or this evening, is that there's a lot of history here in Los Angeles that may not have the same sort of level of exposure. You started to talk about some of the people who I assume are sort of trailblazers here locally. Can you give us a few people that we should be aware of here locally?
You know, folks like we said, Phil Wilson, who is, you know, one of my personal heroes who I've known a very, very long time, who started Black AIDS Institute. And of course, I mentioned Bambi Salcedo. You know, there's been people like the historian Lillian Faderman, who wrote the definitive book on queer history in Los Angeles that really goes into, that's a book I highly recommend for people to read. It really goes into the profound impact that Los Angeles has had on the political and social progress of the queer and trans community. In One Institute's own history, there are people from the 1950s that are, I think, important to name because they were real trailblazers. You know, people like Harry Hay, who founded Mattachine, but also people like Dor Leg and Jim Kepner, who founded One Inc., One Incorporated. Are you asking me about sort of contemporary activists?
No, but I am going to get to that question. So hold that thought. I put that later on. I was just curious about, you know, because again, when I think about like the queer movement, LGBTQ movement, I default to the 2 coasts, San Francisco and New York. And only being in LA for 10 years, I recognize that there's a lot that I don't know, and I'm sure other people don't know, about what's happened here locally as one of the critical points of movement.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I will say that, I mean, maybe this is better known today than it used to be, but of course, the first ever recorded resistance against police harassment was in Cooper's Donuts in downtown LA in 1949, I believe that was. The Black Cat bar riots were in 1966 at the Black Cat in Silver Lake. That was 2 years before Stonewall. The first LGBT center was the LA LGBT Center, founded in 19.
That I knew.
Yes. Some of the first and most significant AIDS service organizations that were serving communities of color were here in Los Angeles, from Vienna Star to Black AIDS Institute to Minority AIDS Project. These were organizations that were taking care of communities outside of West Hollywood, because the work of folks did in West Hollywood and organizations like APLA was really critical and important, but those organizations had blind spots. We have great leaders who, founded organizations that were taking care of communities that were the most impacted by the AIDS epidemic. Or, for example, another thing about Los Angeles that is significant historically is that APLA is an organization that really was responsible for having Hollywood pay attention to the AIDS epidemic, and had people like, Elizabeth Taylor speak up for folks. So there were really key organizations, not to mention the One Institute and the One Archives, which were developed here in Los Angeles as these institutions that continue to exist today. Like the One Archive is the largest collection of queer materials in the world. We used to own the archives at the One Institute. We gifted it to USC in 2010. They are our partner archive. A lot of people think we're the same organization. We're not. Since then, we've been separate organizations, right, but we're strong partners. And we do a lot of public programming. They do the tending of the archive. Honestly, I think that Los Angeles has as many significant contributions to our movements than any other place. They're just lesser known.
Yeah, and thank you for that information, because I do think it is important to kind of broaden our understanding, generally speaking, of Southern California and its footprint and significant work that it's done in the LGBTQ community. There's been a lot of work going on here in Southern California around LA, as an example, LA versus hate, right? As one example, around the attacks on LGBTQ plus communities and the rights, and they continue to increase around the country. Arguably, in the last decade, we've seen a substantial increase in these attacks. What role do you think history and memory and community storytelling play in the resisting of the backlash?
Sure.
Because I also think that's really important to talk about how people have responded, people who are primarily impacted by some of these backlashing policies.
Sure. Well, I think it's not surprising that a lot of the backlash is focused on our erasure. For example, as you know, I used to run Lambda Literary, the queer literary organization, for 9 years. And this has always been the case, but virtually I think it's something like 45-50% of banned books are LGBT topics.
6 out of 10.
6 out of 10, even more, right?
And then in I think 8 or 9 out of 10 with either queer topics or written by queer writers or BIPOC writers. So the majority of books that are banned are of those two communities that have natural intersections.
Exactly. So that is not surprising in that, communities of color, queer communities are made up of activists and artists who are challenging the way that our history has been told, are challenging the ways that we have defined sexuality and gender. And so it is not surprising that it's our stories that are looking to be, or folks attempting to erase our stories. I know that you know this, but very recently in this year, with the removal of the trans community from the Stonewall National Monument website,
right,
by the federal government, just a few weeks ago, They said that the government was going to rename these Navy ships named after Harvey Milk.
Harvey Milk, yeah.
But also, to your point, the others that were going to be renamed are women and people of color.
Yes.
Other made these contributions. Yes, so the backlash has to do with our erasure. And so therefore, organizations like One Institute or libraries, it is important for us to be part of our resistance is for demanding that our stories continue to be told. That is our work. That is our mission in this organization.
How does the narrative play in the resistance? And I think I heard you answer it is by being present and being available, being accessible through the One Institute or institutions like yours, or like the public library, having access to that material is what I heard you say.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that our communities, from queer and non-binary and trans and communities of color who have been activists, who've done, social justice work for decades and decades, there's so many examples of courage and tenacity and perseverance in these communities, right? And one of the things that I've noticed, especially this year, is that we need to stand up and take risks in these areas. I think that there are folks who are, there's a chilling effect in terms of what's been going on in this country. And I think it's important for organizations like ours, for libraries, for, nonprofits, for artists and educators to go out on a limb, because we're being threatened by so many things these days, and say, no, we're going to continue to tell our stories. We're going to continue to uplift these youth in our public schools, because on the one hand, what folks are saying is that they don't exist. When you can't teach about queer and trans history in public schools, the message is they don't exist, or that they're not healthy people, or that they're not important. But we know that that's not true. I think it's important for us to be courageous in these times and insist in telling our stories. And I know that our communities are famous for stepping up in these times. And I do see that. But I think we need to be inspiration to others to keep doing that.
Following this thread a little bit about storytelling and bravery and being courageous in the face of fear, in the face of unprecedented attacks, both from the federal government and people on the ground, how would you suggest one navigates the emotional weight of the histories that we, as institutions of discourse, let's call us that, we're tasked with sharing? I can say from my vantage point, I've had people on my team really just feel demoralized in this moment about trying to simply provide information for a community of people who desire the information, not to indoctrinate, not to groom. But hearing these words about librarians, as an example, being called groomers, or, that's just one of many examples in this moment. How do you see navigating this emotionally? Like, what would you say to someone who's on the front line still and being accused of heinous things that just simply aren't true?
Well, one, I want to say shout out to libraries and librarians, because ever since I've been at Lambda Literary, libraries have been at the front lines of this work, and librarians have been, which is shocking in a way, because this is not how we think about librarians. But libraries and librarians are sharing the stories of the people who make up this country and this world. And that's a diverse group of people. And there's so many stories to share. And thank God that you do the work that you do, because you are a haven to many, many people and many, many youth who, I remember when I was coming out of the closet, one of the most common stories from young queer people was like that they went to the library, and they might have been loners, they might have been super studious, but they went to the library to find themselves and stories about themselves. That's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is that what folks, the sort of forces on the right or forces against sort of a pluralistic society are doing is telling lies. They're telling lies about us. And I think we need to counter those lies head on. I was listening to some news story where there was a school board meeting and they were commenting about queer issues in schools. And there was like a parent who went up there who was calling Harvey Milk a pedophile. And I thought, what? Like, where are they getting this information that's horrendous? And it went unchallenged by the school board. And I thought, how are you letting this happen? These are lies about our communities. These are lies about our youth. And I think we just need to call people out on them. What folks are saying about us, what our detractors are saying, are untrue. And we need to not let those pass. The other thing is that I work with a lot of young people, people in their 20s. And I've been, an activist and in doing this work in the community for over 30 years. And what I often want to remind young people, or just sort of like try to be more of a calming presence, is that we really have been through worse. I don't know what's going to happen in the next year. We understand that for a lot of us who care about social justice, who care about the rights of immigrants and all the communities that we're parts of, that what's happening right now in this country in many ways feels unprecedented. And I think it's correct to be vigilant about it and to understand that things could get worse. But what I want to say is that we have been through worse times, much worse. And the thing about our communities is that we're resourceful, we're courageous, we organize ourselves, we're resilient. And even though it's hard to see right now, I feel confident that we are going to win this war, even though I look at work in social justice work as a long arc. We're going to be doing this work 100, 200 years from now. It'll never end. That's just the nature of it. And I like to talk about this work in that way because I think that it's true. First of all, civil rights work in this country has been going on for a very, very long time. And yet a lot of these lessons don't get learned by too many people. So the work is forever. And I think that when the public understands our humanity, we win. And so I think that's the work that we do in the arts, in literature. We are humanizing our experiences, who we are as people, as queer people, as trans people, as I'm Mexican and Italian. We have stories to tell. This is who America is. We've been through worse and we're going to get through this also, but it takes organizing, it takes commitment. And that's what I see all around me every day in this work that I'm doing.
You bring up two things that I think are really important to just kind of tease out here. First of all, the role of misinformation. And this is a place this is an intersection I believe libraries play a very critical part or role in to dispel misinformation and help people get to accurate information. Because we rely, it's just the nature of the beast, we rely on the internet, unfortunately, and social media more than I think we should for information. Certainly,
Sure.
there's validity in some of that, but a balance with actual resources that are factual rather than just the cesspool of information often found on the internet. So that's one thing I want to say. I think that there's a role here for libraries.
Sure.
But to kind of play on that a little bit more or tease that out, I often wonder, why does it feel so unprecedented? I could say two things, and some of this is from me and some of it's from an archivist that I was listening to speak. I think why it feels that way is the presence of social media. So you are absolutely right, Tony. This has been going on for arguably centuries, and we can see the trajectory going forward being present even another century or two, if not longer. So I agree with that, but I think social media plays a role in, you know, how we doom scroll. I do it every night before I go to sleep. And so it's like this compounding of like misinformation, all kinds of like things that really weigh on you. And I think about young people. I'm getting to my question here. And so that's one thing. And then the archivist said to me recently, she said, just like you did, it was really astounding. We were all having a conversation about like what we can do in this moment as professionals, information professionals. And she's like, we've been here before. She was so calm about it. She's like, we've lived through worse, like you're saying. And then in the moment, it didn't quite land, but as it time goes on, it's resonating because a lot of people are saying what you say, which is true, is that it's been worse than this. I think what's different about this moment is that there's a funding mechanism tied to it or lack thereof that I don't know that we've experienced as
You
of
mean the
late.
federal cuts
That's correct.
and the threats to funding if we have
That's right.
president? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I think that's partially what makes it different. That and this like onslaught of social media and the internet. So my question to you with all of that being said is, who in the next generation should we be looking at? Who do you think does this in the next generation of activists? Who do you see as doing this well, like communicating well, organizing well, advocating and uplifting and advancing this work as a younger person? Is there someone that, or a group or, that you can just kind of bring to light here?
To be honest, there isn't any one in particular or a group in particular. What I can say is that I think that there are many who are taking up this challenge. Let me give you an example. When I was executive director of Foundation for the AIDS Monument, which is an AIDS monument that's going to be built. Are you at the West? No, which library are you at?
I'm at 86 of them, but West
Oh, okay,
Hollywood is
you're all
one of
of them.
mine.
Okay,
Yes,
okay. Your background screen reminds me of the West Hollywood one.
it is. No,
Oh,
you're
okay.
absolutely right. Good
Okay.
call.
Well,
Yes,
right
it
outside
is.
that window, there's going to be an AIDS monument, which will be dedicated at the end of this year, right? And when I was executive director there, one of the things I heard over and over from older people who had been through the worst of the AIDS epidemic, what I heard over and over was this fear that that history would be forgotten and that young people don't care about AIDS or don't care about that history. And while I was hearing this, I was meeting so many young people interested in that history as part of their history. They may have been too young to be in it, but they understood it as a legacy that they're inheriting that taught lessons on how to do activism that to this day is essential to these young people. So it was, for me, I would say to these older folks, I would say, I understand that concern, but I feel confident in telling you that these histories will not be forgotten by our community. In fact, young people are writing articles about them, they're writing books about them, they're comparing that, the AIDS epidemic, to COVID and understanding what the differences are and what the similarities are. This is something, so that's just one example that I believe that there are so many young people who to pass the torch to, honestly. I am around them all the time.
I love hearing this, by
Yes,
the way.
they challenge me because, I'm 57 almost, and I can, I'm an old timer and I'm constantly learning new things. I'm learning about emerging communities, I'm learning about language, I'm learning about new structures in the way we do leadership, right?
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
that's it.
So I think that they learn from their history, but they're reinventing it
And
for
they adapted. Yes,
they're
absolutely.
adapting. Exactly. They're
Yeah.
adapting it. And I think are going to be tackling these issues in ways that may look different, but that are informed by how we did it. So they are standing on our shoulders and understanding that. But I have so much confidence in young activists. I'm around them all the time. They're so motivated. Now, the other thing I want to say is that, and this is where folks like you and me, Sky, also play a role in this, right? I think it's really important for young people to see that there have been folks doing this a really long time who have a connection to that history and who can say things like, you know what, we've been through worse. I don't know everything that's going to happen in the next year to few years, but I can tell you in our history, we've had some incredible challenges. We are smart, we're creative, we've always been this way. And you and I are figuring out how to do this new challenge together, right? So honestly, I feel hopeful about the future of our movements because our younger activists, our younger artists, our younger academics are whip smart and are ready to take things on and not concede to what's going on around them, right?
Yeah.
They're up for the challenge.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So Tony, we're getting to the end and I got to get to some of these questions. I didn't even get to half of my questions. We could be talking. We should do a part two.
Yeah.
But I think we got the core of the questions like in this conversation. I usually end with what are you reading, but I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask you a different question from the audience, which is, what are some of the books that have inspired you or comforted you as you embraced your identity? And so the reason I think this question is important is because I wonder if it is as relevant now for young people as it was, maybe 47 or so years ago when you were trying to find your way.
Sure.
So that's the question. What are some books or a book that inspired you or comforted you? And I bet you have several, being the previous Lambda literary executive director.
I'll name a book, and if it's okay, I'm going to name a documentary because I'm, been in the
I'm
arts.
a huge
right?
documentary fan.
Okay,
that's what I was going to grow up to be. So go for it.
I think that David Wojnarowicz's Close to the Knives, a memoir of disintegration, was one that I read in my 20s, in the early 90s, and was really a transformational experience for me because he was an incredibly important artist of the AIDS era. And this book introduced a world to me where art could be fiercely political, angry, and beautiful. Like the stories that he told about his family, about activism while he and his friends were all dying. I know it sounds strange to say, but was inspirational to me because I felt like this was at a time when I found out I was HIV positive and I didn't, and I thought I was going to die just like everybody else. So it was a worldview that actually made me pivot from just being an activist, which is what I thought my career was going to be from a very young age, to starting to think about arts as activism. And this was in the early 90s. So David Wojnarowicz, Close to the Knives, is right there. It's a hard read, but once you get through that 50, 75 pages, it's remarkable. The documentary, I'll say, was Tongues Untied.
I was hoping someone brought that in. Yes, yeah. I love that. Yes. Marlon Riggs
was arguably one of the greatest documentaries about queerness of the 1990s. That and Paris is Burning. I guess that's 80s maybe, but
that was the 80s and one of my favorites as well.
But Tongues Untied was about African-American queer men navigating the queer white world and just the way that you could be analytical about your life as a person of color in a white dominant world and find a way through that to community, a community in this case of Black queer men.
In the DC area, I believe, very localized, I think so.
If you haven't seen that movie, Marlon Riggs, that documentary, it's required watching.
100%.
That was another piece of art that just gave me another view of queerness that was outside of the mainstream, that was, I don't want to say against the dominant narrative, because it was more than that. It was elevated in so many ways. Those two were these artworks that I think really had me start looking at a life as an activist that was also in the arts.
Yeah, I love that. If I could just add one bit to Tongues Untied, I think that it was really one of those moments where it was a reminder that these other communities exist outside the white gay male narrative. And it gave way to other communities also kind of fleshing it out. Or, I mean, same with Paris is Burning, same with Marsha P.
Johnson, yeah.
Johnson, thank you. I don't know why I was going to say Washington, but these are just reminders that this community is very large, very diverse, and with vastly different backgrounds that incorporates a lot of different people. So that's what I loved about that one. And then, of course, the one he did with Essex Hemphill that is escaping me right now. I was going to say Black is Black Ain't, but I can't remember if that's what it's called. Let me get back to some of these questions. Again, I could talk to you all day about these things. Where I'd love to end this is, when we talk about young people, we talk about the work that you do with K through 12. We talk about feeling really comfortable and excited about this next generation of activists and artists. How does a young person, or any person really, how do they come work for you? How do they get involved with One Institute? Where would we direct them to?
Sure. Well, the young people who are in K through 12 schools, we have programs specifically for them, right? And so if any young person is listening to this, just get on our newsletter, and next time there's the call for applications for the youth ambassadors, or for what other programs are specifically for high school students, apply to them, right? But there are so many other ways to get involved. Like right now, this summer, we have 5 interns. That's another way to work with us throughout the summer. We have 5 summer interns from Oxy, from UCLA, from Harvard, from probably another school. I think those are the 3. So they're working with us, learning what it is to run a nonprofit organization and to run
Oh, wow.
queer arts nonprofit organization programs. That's another way, because we do internships every year, and you can, if you're a college student, you can apply to them. But the other thing is that we do so many public programs. Like in October, which is Queer History Month, we have a massive program called Circa Queer Histories Festival. We literally have dozens of programs throughout that month. There's readings, screenings, performance, workshops, lectures in every corner of this county. Last year, we were in all 5 supervisorial districts. This year, because we're in the process of organizing the 2025 Circa Festival in October, we have 40-something programs that we're going to be putting on. We need so much help with that. We need volunteers to help us, from setting up the rooms, to being on our steering committees, to assisting in so many different ways that are engaging with our queer arts communities. And so it's a great way to get to learn who the queer and trans artists and educators and activists are in Los Angeles, because we work with so many of them for the Circa Festival. So that's another thing, is just reach out to us. It's easy to find us on the website. So there's just countless ways to get involved with the kind of work we're doing, which is really rooted in cultural communities of queer Los Angeles.
Tony, it's been such a pleasure. I definitely think we need to come back with a part 2. I think we have more to talk about.
Sure, absolutely. Anytime. It's such a pleasure speaking with you. And just to be part of an LA County Library program, I'm honored because I have such an admirer of the work that you do.
Oh, we appreciate that. Thank you, Tony Valenzuela. And thank you for everyone who showed up today. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Take good care.